Azure Migrate. In this video, we will talk about how to start migrating from your on-premises virtual machine or physical machine sets into Microsoft Azure. Migration usually is one of the reasons that people avoid moving towards cloud computing to Azure. They are afraid of if the migration is going to be successful, if it is possible at all, and all the other concerns of such. In this video, we will see how you can use the tools provided by Microsoft Azure in order to be able to assess, evaluate, and figuring out if you're ready for migration or not. Azure Migrate helps you discover and assess the suitability of on-premises machines for migration to Azure and provides sizing and cost estimate for running Azure VMs. Basically, with going through the Azure Migrate process, you will know all the information necessary for you in order to make a decision on whether you should migrate to Azure or not. The Azure Migrate service assesses on-premises workloads for migration to Azure. The service assesses the migration suitability of on-premises machines, performs performance-based sizing, and provides cost estimates for running on-premises machines in Azure. So by the end of the time you run Azure Migrate on your machine, you will have all the information you need to make that decision. Remember, this assessment also will do the performance-based sizing for you so that you know which size of Azure VMs you're going to need, which is going to be then the basis for figuring out the cost that you have to pay in order to have the same type of environment run by your Azure. If you are contemplating lift and shift migrations or are in the early assessment stages of migration, this service is for you. After assessment, you can use services such as Azure Site Recovery and Azure Database Migration Service to migrate the machines to Azure. The question is, why should you even use the Azure Migrate? Let's see what we get using the Azure Migrate. The first is assessing Azure readiness. The Azure Migrate assesses whether your on-premises machines are suitable for running in Azure or not. Are those even supported or not? The second is getting the size recommendations. You will get size recommendations for Azure VMs based on the performance history of on-premises VMs. So basically what Azure Migrate does is looks at the performance history of what you have and how they have been used, and based on that performance service recommends which one of the virtual machine sizes is actually more proper for your migration. Sometimes the size is going to be based on what type of premium or standard storages are on the virtual machine, and sometimes is based on what type of processing and compute power that a specific size of virtual machine provides to you. So after having all this information in hand, of course you can estimate the monthly costs when you know which size of virtual machines you have and you know what type of compute services will be running on those. Then you can easily get estimated cost for running on-premises machines of yours in the Azure environment. And finally, it gives you migration with high confidence possibility. Visualize dependencies of on-premises machines to create groups of machines that you will assess and migrate together. So note that the possibility of migration at once is available here. Let's talk about some of the current limitations of Azure Migrate. First, you can only assess on-premises VMware virtual machines or VMs for migration to the Azure VMs. This means you cannot assess the suitability of your physical servers that you withhold on premises. Support for Hyper-V is currently in preview with product support. Again, note that the VMware virtual machines are supported at this point. For assessment of physical servers, you can leverage any third-party tools. There are multiple third-party tools provided by other vendors that can help you assess if your physical machine is ready to be migrated to Azure or not. The dependency visualization functionality is not available in Azure Government at this point. So again, you can use third-party tools to figuring that out. Azure Migrate supports up to only 20 projects per subscription. Good news is you can break down your migrations into a smaller size projects and do them at once. But then the maximum you can do is going to be 20 per subscription. You can discover up to 1500 VMs in a single discovery and in a single project. Again, if you have more than 1500 VMs, in that case you can break those down into multiple projects and discover them in different projects. Considering that there are only 20 projects available per subscription, if you only have one subscription, that means you can have 20 times 1500 VMs in the process of discovery. Azure has a preview release available that allows discovery of up to 10,000 VMware VMs. Again, remember, VMware VMs in a single project using a single appliance. If you want to discover a larger environment than this, then you can split the discovery and create multiple projects and go from there. Let's look at the geographical availability of the Migrate. It is important to always have in mind that you can only create an Azure Migrate project in the following geographicals. However, this does not restrict your ability to create assessments for other target Azure locations. So, for the geography of Azure government, you can do US government Virginia. And everything is going to be stored over there. If you are in Asia, then your storage will be Southeast Asia or East Asia. If you are in Europe, then your storage location will be North Europe or West Europe. And finally, if you are in beloved United States of America, your storage location is East US or West Central US. The reason that you look into the geographical availabilities is the fact that some Azure customers are concerned about where their information will be stored and where is the actual physical location of the information, which actually will put some minds into ease. So let's see how the data is going to be stored. The geography associated with the migration project is used to store the metadata discovered from the on-premises environment. Metadata is stored in one of the regions based on the geography specified for the migration project. If you use dependency visualization by creating a new log analytics workspace, the workspace is created in the same region as the project. Let's take a look at what is actually an assessment. In the couple of slides coming from now on, we will look at the property and we will talk about the details that property entails. The first is the target location. The Azure location to which you want to migrate is your target location. Azure Migrate currently supports 33 regions as migration targets. By default, the target region is set to the East US. Remember that this information could be changed at any given time. So when it comes to the numbers with Microsoft Azure, I always recommend you to look up the latest numbers in docs.azure.microsoft.azure. The next property is the storage type, which is the type of managed disks you want to allocate for all VMs that are part of the assessment. This also is going to help Microsoft Azure to give you a better estimate of your cost. If the sizing criterion is an on-premises sizing, you can specify the target disk type either as premium disks, which is the default, standard SSD disks, or standard HDD disks. For performance-based sizing, along with the above options, you also have the option to select automatic, which will ensure that the disk sizing recommendation is automatically done based on the performance data of your VMs, which basically is one of the options that most of the IT admins use when they don't want to take care of the calculations themselves. In this case, Azure looks into the performance history of that virtual machine and chooses the best and most suitable drive for that situation. For example, if you want to achieve a single instance VM SLA of 99.9%, you may want to specify the storage type as premium managed disk, which will ensure that all disks in the assessment will be recommended as premium managed disks. Note that Azure Migrate only supports managed disk for migration assessment. The key over here is if you set that property, the storage type property, it will affect how Azure recommends you. So that should be kept in mind in order to avoid any confusion when it comes to suggesting the disk sizes. Next property is reserved instances, which is whether you have reserved instances in Azure or not. Azure Migrate estimates the cost accordingly. Next is sizing criterion. Sizing can be based on performance history of the on-premises VMs, which is the default, or as on-premises without considering the performance history. When we talk about performance history, remember that we're talking about a day of performance, basically the last day. This doesn't need you to think about a long history of this VM being working. If your VM has been in the work for the last 24 hours, then you have a performance history with that and you can use it for the evaluation of the sizing. Or you can simply choose the other option, which is as on-premises, which does not consider the performance history and does not do the optimization for you. So the sizing criterion comes to the play to give you a better performance when you migrate to Azure if you use the performance history. But again, remember, based on one day, it all depends on how your business was running on that last day. So by default, Azure Migrate evaluates the performance of on-premises machines using performance history for the last day with 95 percentile value. So VM series is the other property of an assessment. The VM series used for size estimation. For example, if you have a production environment that you do not plan to migrate to A series VMs in Azure, you can exclude A series from the list or series. Sizing then is going to be based on the selected series only. So as you know, the higher series of the VMs in Microsoft Azure tend to provide better performance, but at the same time they tend to provide more cost on the final invoice. And therefore, if your mission is not as critical as being in need of the best, or if it is so critical that you don't want to go to the lower VMs under no circumstances, then in that case, you can choose the VM series and exclude or include the series you want or the series you don't want. The other property, which is very easy to understand, is the currency, which is the billing currency, and the default is going to be the US dollars. Next property is the discount. So yes, Azure provides a lot of discounts, especially these days. Any subscription specific discount you receive on top of the Azure offer is under that property. The default setting is 0% unless you have a coupon or a code that can show you have extra discounts. Next property is the VM uptime. If your VMs are not going to be running 24/7 in Azure, you can specify the duration, which is the number of days per month and number of hours per day for which they would be running, and the cost estimation will be done accordingly. The default value is 31 days per month and 24 hours per day. So basically 100% of the times. And then sometimes there is an Azure offer, which that's the Azure offer you're enrolled to. Azure Migrate estimates the cost accordingly. So if you're looking at that property and that's not really the offer you're going with, make sure you're changing it to whatever you want to estimate under. And then the Azure Hybrid benefit is the next property, which is about whether you have software assurance and are eligible for Azure Hybrid benefit with the discount cost. Usually is more focused on Microsoft products itself. Next property is the comfort factor. Azure Migrate considers a buffer or a comfort factor during assessment. This buffer is applied on top of machine utilization data for VMs, which is CPU, memory, disks, and network. The comfort factor accounts for issues such as seasonal usage, short performance history, and likely increase in future usage. For example, a 10-core VM with 20% utilization normally results in a 2-core VM. However, with a comfort factor of 2.0, the result is a 4-core VM instead. The default comfort factor is 1.3 times. So basically what happens through using comfort factor is you're going to receive a buffer for the future increase of the use in comparison with the day or the time you're running your Azure Migrate assessment tool. This way, Azure is recommending more resources to be dedicated to your VMs after migration, and therefore, if by chance in future or near future you get all the way up to 1.3 times more demand from the users of your VMs, you still are on the safe side. You can change this to any type of comfort factor that you want, but always consider this as the possible tolerance of the future demands on your services within the Azure VM system. Of course, the estimate is going to be higher than what you need today, and therefore you have to pay more. You can also decrease this comfort factor so that in future, if you think in future you're not going to have extra demand on your machines, this way you're not going to pay more today. So let's go through the steps and see how does it work. So you create an Azure Migrate project. That's the first step. Then Azure Migrate uses an on-premises VM called Collector Appliance to discover information about your on-premises machines. To create the appliance, you download a setup file in Open Virtualization Appliance or .ova format and import it as a VM on your on-premises vCenter. Remember, OVA is basically the extension for the virtual softwares or the softwares that you run in the virtual environment. It is not exactly the .exe for the on-premises machines, but it's something close to that when it comes to the virtual appliance. Next step is you connect the VM from the vCenter server and specify a new password for it while connecting. Then you run the collector on the VM to initiate the discovery. You're going to see these in action during the demo video. Step 5 is the collector collects VM metadata using the VMware PowerCLI commandlets, and discovery is agentless. This is important. Please remember, discovery is agentless and doesn't install anything on VMware hosts or VMs. So it basically just looks into them, see the information, and moves on. Nothing will be added, so your VMs are intact after this assessment. The collected metadata includes VM information, which are number of cores, amount of memory, size of the disks, type of the disks, and the network adapters. It also collects performance data for VMs, including CPU and memory usage, disk IOPS, disk throughputs, and network output. Next step, the metadata is pushed to the Azure Migrate project. You can view it in the Azure portal after this step. On the final steps, number 7, for the purpose of assessment, you gather the discovered VMs into groups. For example, you might group VMs that run the same application. For more precise grouping, you can use dependency visualization to view dependencies of a specific machine or for all machines in a group and refine the group. You usually want to keep the machines which have heavier dependencies on each other within the same group and those with looser dependencies in different groups. After a group is defined, you create an assessment for that specific group. And after the assessment finishes, you can view it in the portal or download it in Excel format. At that point, you basically have a very good idea of how and how many of your VMs are ready to be moved to the Azure. So it's a pretty simple process, very straightforward. For those of you who are familiar with the OVA applications already, you know how to run any OVA application, and that's no different. So let's take a look at this diagram. As you see, you have your collector VM over here, which sends the raw material to the Azure Migrate service, which then is going to be processed on the metadata to give you the Azure Migrate portal report, and here is where you get your assessment. So basically it's simple. That's your collector, sends the information to the cloud, to the Azure, and it processes the metadata which is collected from these guys down here and gives you the assessment. Of course, these are your VMs, existing host and VMs that you have, which are going to get connected to the vCenter server as we discussed it. And the raw metadata of these guys is going to be collected by the collector and going all the way through the path. Okay, let's review the steps over here on the diagram once more. So the first step is you happen to be this person in the middle, downloading and configuring the appliance on the virtual center server. And then you start the discovery through running the collector, which is going to then collect the raw metadata from these servers through the vCenter center, and then sends that metadata, the raw metadata, to the Azure, which then is going to process it, and you basically are going to create the assessment with setting up the properties that we already discussed. Remember all those tables of properties that we went through? And based on the properties you set and the information collected from these guys sending up to the cloud, this Azure Migrate portal is going to create your assessment, which then is going to help you make the final decision on if you want to move or how you want to move and migrate from your on-premises setting into the Azure cloud VM services. Okay, let's finalize and review the components and requirements once again together. As you can see, we start with the collector, which communicates with Azure Migrate service, and the collector connects to the service on SSL port 443. Remember, this is a secure connection that you start. Then we have the vCenter server, which is a part of the collector. And by default, the collector connects to the vCenter server on port 443. And if the server listens on a different port, configure and make sure it is an outgoing port on the collector VM. And then you have your on-premises VMs, which basically communicate with the log analytics workspace. And the Microsoft Monitoring Agent MMA uses TCP port 443 to connect to Azure Monitor Logs. You only need this port if you're using dependency visualization that requires MMA agent, or otherwise there is no need for this port. So let's see what happens after the assessment. Now that you have the assessment, after you have assessed on-premises machines, you can use a couple of tools to perform the migration. One is the Azure Site Recovery. You can use Azure Site Recovery to migrate to Azure. To do this, you prepare the Azure components you need, including a storage account and virtual network. On premises, you prepare your VMware environment. When everything's prepared, you set up and enable a replication to Azure and migrate the VMs. This is so close to the Azure disaster recovery process. The other is Azure database migration. If on-premises machines are running a database such as SQL Server or MySQL or Oracle, you can use the Azure Database Migration Service to migrate them to the Azure. Now let's take a quick look at the documentation provided by Azure under docs.microsoft.com. I want to take you to the Discover and Assess On-Premises VMware VMs for Migration to the Azure tutorial. This tutorial is also available on our Canvas if you want to take it step by step. So basically, as you can see, we look at some prereqs. Before you start, you have to make sure the VMs that you plan to migrate are managed by vCenter server running versions of 5.5, 6, 6.5, or 6 and 7. Additionally, you need the ESXi host running version 5.5 or higher to deploy the collector VM. This usually is the major one. If your VMs on VMware are compatible, the rest of them are possibly already there. So before you start the tutorial, make sure that all the prerequisites are actually in place. Then next step is creating an account for VM discovery. And Azure Migrate needs access to VMware servers to automatically discover VMs for assessment. You have to create a VMware account with these prerequisites so that that VMware account can actually have access to your VMs. The key here is, if I cannot have access to your VM, how can I assess your VM? And that's why you provide the access. Then you will sign into the Azure portal and create a project for yourself. As we discussed it before, you want to make sure your project is under one of these geographical and storage locations. So the tutorial is going to walk you through how to do that. Then download the collector appliance, which is the one which is going to be running and actually collecting information over there. You can go through the steps. They're very clear over here, and they clearly let you know where to go and how to download that. And then create a project, verify the collector, and then run the collector. Remember, depending on discovery type you're doing, there are different OVA versions of the application with different type of hashes that you can study and figure out which one is the best for your situation. And then you create a collector VM, which the OVA file is going to be running on that. And then you run the collector to discover your VMs, as we discussed in the diagram in the video, to get all the information you need. And finally, verify the VMs in the Azure portal. When everything is ready for that, you create and view your assessment, which basically is nothing but a report that you can even download as an Excel file. And this is how the assessment details are going to look like. So basically, at the end of this point, you're ready to make that decision for whether you want to migrate or avoid migration. You can also come down here and see the cost estimates, the monthly cost estimates, which is going to be like this. And you can see how much you will be paying on top of what you already are paying or below that, which based on the budget which is provided to you can help you make a decision again. And then you have different confidence ratings down here. Remember, we talked about these basically are the tolerances from what you get. Okay, you see that 1 star is 0 to 20%, 2 star is 21 to 40%, and so on and so on. You can change that, and then finally when you have that, you can start looking at the machine dependency mappings and so on in order to make the final decisions. The reason I'm going very quick through this document is because this is already in the canvas for you to go through and do this hands-on tutorial in order to get more information about how Microsoft Migrate works. Before we get out of here, I want to navigate over here to this document, which is Prepare On-Premises VMware Services for Disaster Recovery to Azure. And this is a very short document. I'd really like you to take a look at that. And this document is helping you understand how your VMs should be set up in order to be members of your disaster recovery plan. The reason that we want to look at this is one of the ways to finally migrate all your VMs to Azure is just treating them as what happens after a disaster. So through the disaster recovery tool and through the Azure Site Recovery Services, which is documented very well down here, you can simply use the site recovery service in order to move your stuff to the Azure without any problem. This document is actually a shorter document, this one and the previous one, and they give you an idea of how the replication happens. Pretty much these are the things that I want to show you before finishing this video. Hopefully this video is useful for you and you can start doing your VM recoveries and VM migrations by yourselves. And that concludes the video.